Alright, I'm trying something new. I ripped out the page. Probably be better if I didn't, but regardless. I'd like to propose an interesting idea. Privatizing, it seems I forgot an N, the seas. To explain this idea, it's built on two basic principles. The tragedy of the commons, apologies for the pause, didn't want to interrupt my roommate. Anyways, it's built on the tragedy of the commons as a basic idea, plus privatization, specifically private conservation. See, people like the sea, I'd assume. I assume a lot of us would like to see the seas clean and taken care of. So, if all of the seas were taken out of the commons and instead were placed into private hands, we could see an increase in prosperity as well as an increase in conservation. See, for those who don't know the basics of the Tragedy of the Commons, it states that when resources are scarce, common ownership is abused. That is the best way to describe it outside of saying short-term interest suffers when dealing with communal land. Both of these definitions are good enough to describe the situation, but basically, land held in common, or publicly, often suffers when it comes to individual actions because of this exact problem, scarcity. See, when things are scarce, people want more. Fairly obvious. Think about it. If you know there's 80 gallons of water in a tank, and you need water, of course, to live, you're likely going to take as much water out of that 80-gallon holder as you can to keep for yourself just in case. That is just pragmatism. You don't know when you're going to get more water, so it's better to take what you can now. So when it's held in common, what often happens is instead of rationing out resources, people take as much as they can and try to basically take for what they can from it. The ocean is a similar concept. When the seas are, by all intents and purposes, held in common, what you see is people taking advantage. Take Alaska as an example. The United States has territorial waters, as do all nations in the UN. Well, all the ones with an ocean. But at the edge of it, so let's say this is Alaska. It's probably not going to look very good, but let's say that this right here will be our Alaska. It's not a good drawing of Alaska, but screw it, it'll work. And so, it has its territorial waters that extend out from the borders. I'm probably going to want to actually hold down this, but you can see the basics. See, this water is under Alaskan and thereby U.S. jurisdiction. But right here, it's international. And that creates a problem, because guess who's over here? Right over here, Russia. Guess who's also over here? Japan. Japan's not as close, especially after World War II, but they still have islands that are fairly close by. So what you end up seeing is salmon go through here because there's rivers nearby, and they go up the rivers to spawn. Well, guess what Russian and Japanese fishermen do? They camp out in these international waters, not subject to U.S. regulations or really anyone's decision making, and just fish, fish, fish. And because it's not their territorial waters, it's international, they overfish, and so it's a common problem. By converting it to private industries instead, so let's imagine, hypothetically, here, I'll pause real quick while I draw this. Okay, I finished my drawing. So if you look here, I've divided it up into plots. So, basically taking our waters and dividing them into plots similar to like the Homestead Act did, where every piece of territory to the west was divided and people were allowed to claim by settling there. If we instead divide up plots and sell them off or hand them to conservation organizations, I prefer some going to conservation organizations, especially those in areas where known endangered species are. We can simultaneously reduce this problem because now private individuals are going to protect their interests, but simultaneously we'll also see people caring more, because guess what? Imagine you own this plot of land right here, or rather plot of sea. Alright, you're a commercial fisherman and you get this plot. Well, what do you want to do with that plot? You want to increase yields. So depending on your goal, let's assume you're a salmon fisher, or you catch other fish in the area. You're going to want to increase the reproduction while maintaining a stable population so that you have more, yields year over year. So that's the incentive for a commercial fisher. What about a conservationist? Well, they're going to want to keep it safe. Maybe they're going to want to sell a tour, show you the glory that your plot contains. And of course, the larger fishers will have their own goals, and the private fishers, so I say private, it'd be better described more like family-owned fishers rather than purely commercial, would have their own as well. In fact, I could easily see it being not just the seas that we do this to, but potentially the rivers as well. See, rivers suffer from a similar problem. A lot of people use them as just commons. But if we privatize them and, say, gave them to local businesses or established businesses for sections of them, given Alaska's history, a co-op or two would work as well, then we could effectively reduce pollution, because when pollution affects your profits or your tied interest to the area, you're likely going to try to reduce it. Simultaneously, with rivers, if a waterway is useful for something like, say, transport, then you're going to make sure to take care of it for that purpose. Critical watershed, same thing. See, privatization of sea territory isn't that crazy concept. Furthermore, if we sell it to commercial fishers, we don't need to sell it to the nonprofits because, well, they're nonprofits. Their goal is just to manage it. And so in the name of environmental causes, it wouldn't be that hard to just hand it out. But if we sell it to commercial interests, we could also make a profit. The government, since it's technically under its jurisdiction, could 100% sell it, make a profit, and use that money to help pay for the debt to go down, or use it for other conservation efforts. Because remember, we want to keep our ecosystem alive because it's profitable to do so, and because it's just a nice ecosystem. Hard to argue with that. And so, naturally, we have a setup which encourages profitability, conservation, and, of course, nature. So everyone wins. Now, one may wonder, what about the local fishermen who don't own a plot? Well, in the case of places up here, maybe one or two could be allocated to a native group. especially given Alaska Natives do have their own companies. It wouldn't be hard to sell a plot or two to a native corporation. Or, in the case of local fishermen that aren't natives and thus don't have their corporations, we could potentially have them be able to give out licenses to fish or do other commercial activity in the area. In fact, we could entirely privatize fishing game, or at least the fishing part of it, that way. We could negotiate necessarily if that is believed to be the best choice, but I don't believe it is. Now, when it comes to this, and especially if we're going to sell it, I would like to make a few things clear. 1. No multinational conglomerates. This should be purely just commercial fishermen, specifically more local ones to help boost competition. Simultaneously, no investment firms, no BlackRock, no Vanguard, none of it. See, yes, over time, it would naturally still be productive, but think about it like this. We have the opportunity to make a good 99% of all plots successful. If we sell some to BlackRock and Vanguard, it could go down to 90%. I'd personally prefer the 99%, so if we control who we give this out to and reduce speculation, yes, it's still capitalist, yes, it still works, but it's a smooth transition to help prevent any problems that come from dealing with BlackRock. Frankly, I think those guys should be dissolved given how much they rely on the government and are basically a third arm of it. Actually, technically before that, but regardless. Enough of my potential speculations about crushing BlackRock into the soil. What matters is, when people think that public ownership makes things better, they're basically lying to themselves. The tragedy of the commons proves this quite handily. What happened in the tragedy of the commons, hence why it's called it, is in villages there would be some houses, of course, and in England there was common land. So let's say you have a small group here, let's say 8 houses, and each has their own little grazing area for animals. Alright, so here's the commons. Now, what does everyone do when they have the option to use the commons instead of their own fields? Well, they abuse the commons, weighing it down, damaging it, lowering the yields, and eventually the commons basically became useless to everyone. Hence why it's called the tragedy of the commons. And now everyone was stuck using their own land. This, of course, eventually led to them, due to being less competitive, being consolidated into large manors under the tenant system. They became tenant farmers, largely. And so, the tragedy of the commons saw short-term interests sabotage long-term ones because public land was not treated as it should. Now one may say, well, we could treat it better. Really? Somalia ring a bell? Those guys had commons. Their seas were commons. What happened? Oh right, as soon as the commons was no longer able to be protected by force, others came in and overfished there and abused it. That helps no one, but short-term interest said, yeah, let's do it, and Somalia can protect itself. If the Somalian people own that land in private and were legally allowed to defend it themselves, the Somalian pirates likely would not have been formed as an entity we see today. Bare minimum, it would have been weaker, especially because now Somalians have an incentive not to raid and be pirates, because that sabotages local ecosystems and makes their lives worse. See, privatization of land has been shown to increase yields, sustainability, and value. better places. Look between a private school and public school and you'll see, generally, they do better. Same principle here. Same principle with a homestead versus feudalism. Rather than holding everything in common, it'd be better and more efficient to divide it up, privatize it. And thus, we could simultaneously reduce pollution, because think about it, you wouldn't want plastic here, would you? So you'd remove it. Same with anyone here, 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 or here. They'd remove it. That cleans up pollution. Simultaneously, the increased yields means greater profits, so naturally greater taxes, and it would also result in better situations for everyone else in the state and the country as a whole. Alaska could be an interesting experiment with this, and I'd support an Alaskan experiment with this, especially if the UN gave us the international waters that everyone keeps fishing in, to be divided and plotted like the rest of the state's waterways. Now, this may go against a UN resolution, but the UN can go suck it, considering they can't do jack. Can help with the Congo crisis, can help with Somalia. They're basically useless, plain and simple. I don't care what the UN says, because they can't run their own garbage. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, and I believe, fundamentally, it would allow for conservation through private wills, reduction of the tragedy of the commons by removing the commons, and an increase in value and productivity. So yeah, have a good one.